And so that, for the most part, brings us to the end of the material we prepared. I know that was incredibly rules heavy, but some of those key rules that we've talked about tonight are what I consider to be the lesser known, or those that are generally considered to be permitted, and you likely believe you're permitted, but there's some nuance to some of those rules, or some grey areas that are really important to be aware of. So I think what we're going to do, Ayla, is throw it to questions. And there's a
Yeah,
couple in
so
there, and you might even be able to help me with a couple of them.
yes. Well, I'm gonna ask the question to start with, and I'm happy to chip in on the answer. So we've got a question here. Is a low-lying area not connected to a waterway considered a CSA? I didn't think so, but ES has requested a client to fence off and exclude cattle. It's a good question, and I'll
It
pass to you,
is.
Chrissy, and then I'll give you my 2 cents.
Perfect. So I think what's really interesting about this question is that you've emphasized that it's not connected to a waterway, and that's really important, as I suspect you've picked up. The definition of a critical source area is that it has the potential to transfer contaminants, whether that be nutrients or sediment or microbes and the like, to a waterway. And so I would question Environment Southland on their interpretation of connected to a waterway, to understand why they consider it connected, as it might just be a misunderstanding, or maybe some level of educational reminder is even required. But if it's not connected to a waterway, I wouldn't have thought it has to be fenced off and cattle excluded. Ayla, do you agree? It'll be context specific, of course.
Context specific. I was just going to emphasize that I really feel that critical source areas, even though we have a very clear definition, can be a grey area. And I really have seen that and across different farms as well. I think in the question it started off saying it's a low-lying area. One of the things that I'd be really focused on with that is, does it have the potential to accumulate contaminants and then deliver them to a waterway? And so a couple of things that probably need to be factored into that. If it's a low-lying area, what's the slope adjacent to that area? How far is it from a waterway? So you stated that it's not connected to a waterway. It might not have a defined bed that's connected to a waterway. But if it is a low-lying wet area that is adjacent to a waterway, then it probably does meet the definition of a critical source area. It can be really hard. It can be really frustrating. I've recently been out on farm with a client that did have a compliance, an Environment Southland compliance officer there for a winter grazing purpose. And so, for this client, they didn't interpret that what they had grazed was a critical source area. They felt that it was just a natural form of the paddock. And so there was a little bit of discussion around, and it really was probably in the grey area. But for this particular swale, which was what we were looking at, the adjacent slope of that area was quite steep. Also, there was a bit of a natural spring that actually had actually basically accumulated and turned that area into, it was actually like flowing into a waterway at one point. So there's often multiple things that you need to probably consider. One really useful tool is look online, like see what different tools might be available. Environment Southland do have a feature where they have actually used LiDAR, and this is publicly available. You can drag your mouse from one point to the other across an area, and it will give you the profile of what that looks like. And so that can be really useful for determining, is a swale clearly defined? And that resolution's up to 1 meter accurate. So it can be really useful as a tool to prove or not prove. That can be a bit of a catch. So I wouldn't go doing that for your whole farm. But if you have an area that you're really a bit confused about what it means, I think what activities are happening in that area also quite important. If it's just being grazed by sheep, then maybe I wouldn't be so worried about it. If it's an area that's potentially going to be cultivated, and those different higher risk activities, then yes, I would be more cautious than not. And so I hope that helps to answer the question. It's definitely a grey area, and I think it definitely, when you're on farm, there's going to be different levels of what that means based on the topography, based on the rainfall, based on all of those different factors that come into it. So if in doubt, I think ask the question, as Chrissy has said, there's lots of people out there that want to try and help in this space. So, ask the question and look around for that. We can make sure as well that we circulate a link to that bit of software that shows you that you can actually look at the profile of the land, and that's available just for Southland. So we can share that after the webinar. Right. In terms of, there was just a follow-up question there. Can you talk about swale management and ephemeral streams around cultivation, etc.? I'll throw that one to you, Chrissy.
I'm going to give you my planning spin on it, and then you might have your practical realities 2 cents as well. So I think with regards to swales, ephemeral streams, and cultivation, it's going to depend entirely on whether you are sowing a crop for the purposes of intensive winter grazing, or whether it's a pasture species, and then of course method of cultivation, slope of the surrounding ground. So I think if you are cultivating a crop, I think it would be safe to say that a swale or an ephemeral stream needs to be excluded and not cultivated, because it's going to probably meet the critical source area definition, and our winter grazing rules specify that you cannot cultivate or graze those areas. If it's for establishing pasture and it's currently dry land, you should be allowed to cultivate those areas, so long as you're also using the right method with depending on your slope. For example, some of the steeper sloping land requires direct drilling or oversowing, then with following that with stock for periods of time to establish pastures, or until and then when pastures are established. Sorry, I'm losing my words there for a moment, but yeah, so I think crop would be a no-go, but if it's pasture, there should be a mechanism in which you can cultivate those areas as a permitted activity. Ayla, do you agree?
Yeah, I think that sounds really good. And the slide that Chrissy had included really summarized what does apply in the different cultivation situations, essentially. So, going into permanent pasture, is this establishment method, then yes, there's a permitted activity pathway. Anything over 20 degrees, it's a little bit more challenging. And so definitely would be looking at the rules before maybe potentially breaking in an area that hasn't been cultivated before that you're not sure about in particular. The comment on ephemeral streams, I think in Southland maybe not, they don't occur as much as Otago, that's for sure. And but yeah, I think ephemeral streams is really important in some landscapes where they are actually more common than not. And so if and especially in areas of Otago where we have lower rainfall, we do have more ephemeral streams than permanently flowing streams, and they're still really important for biodiversity and water quality and all sorts of things. And so the management of those is a little bit different. In terms of, if you just relate that question to cultivation, I'd absolutely agree with Chrissy's assumption, especially where we're looking at potentially winter grazing. You need to make sure that buffer distance from the ephemeral waterway also applies, because in our definition of intensive winter grazing, those buffer distances are from a natural or modified watercourse, regardless of whether or not there's water in it at the time. So that's where that would capture those ephemeral waterways. Also, what's really important is when you're identifying waterways on your farm, on your map, I would always encourage showing ephemeral waterways in a different color or in a different symbology, because like we talked about before, those areas might be freely grazed by sheep, even if they're on flat land when there's no water in them. There's different risks associated with those different types of activities. And so that's something to consider. You might still need to have culverts and those sorts of things in those ephemeral waterways. So considering, a lot of those rules will still apply. Also vegetation, one of the main things that you want to consider is making sure that ephemeral waterway isn't blocked, by any type of activity that you might be wanting to do in or around it, because at some point there will be flowing water through there. So it's, considering some of those things. We have seen, and this is probably more specific to Otago, but in some cases where naturally ephemeral waterways occur and there's actually a break in where the water naturally flows, often there's a really healthy population of galaxids or native fish at the upstream reaches of those areas, because there's a natural fish barrier preventing predation. So there can be advantages to having those ephemeral waterways on farm and reasons to protect them. And so with potentially a changing climate and maybe changing periods where that waterway does fully flow, then you want to consider, do you need to protect the habitat of those things like galaxids in the upper portions of that waterway? So that's pretty much our questions.
I thought I might just jump in really quickly, because I have fact checked myself, because I wanted to make sure I'm giving the right advice. Is that ephemeral waterways are included in the definition of what a waterway or a river is. However, the definition of ephemeral is the bit that's not well defined, and Environment Southland does it a little bit differently to the way other regions, I've seen other regions have a slightly different view, and it is a matter that always pops up in case law, and there's also many examples in case law which doesn't give us one clear set of guidelines or rules or set one precedence. And so if the ephemeral waterway deep meets Southland's definition for ephemeral, it's very likely going to be considered a waterway or river. And then those cultivation rules, to be a permitted activity, it requires you to not cultivate in the bed of a waterway. And so therefore it would have to be excluded from cultivation. So there will be some nuance, whether it's truly ephemeral or not. And there are some arguments you can make in and around whether it actually is or isn't for maybe practical purposes, like having an easier paddock to cultivate than having to dodge all sorts of bits and bobs.
Awesome. Thanks, Chrissy. Well, that brings us to the end of the Q&A. We appreciate those couple of questions, and thanks to the Thriving Southland team for hosting the webinar tonight. As Chrissy mentioned, we're happy to help with any questions that might come up in future, and you've got really good support in Southland with the Thriving Southland team, so make sure you reach out and talk to anyone when you have questions, and hope everyone enjoys their evening.
Thanks everyone, it was fantastic to have so many of you online, and thanks to Thriving Southland, you do fantastic work.